We have an incredible pilot, an incredible aviator, Mr. Ken Hoffman, a person with more than 60 years in aviation experience. He got his first CFI job in 1962, correct? And you have more than 19,000 hours, I believe? Yes. Or could it be 20,000 by now? And I love the thought. Thank you so much for being with us. And I can't wait to hear your story. Of course, Captain Ken Hoffman, in 2013, received the Wright Brothers Award, right? And in 2017, he has also received the NAFI Lifetime Achievement Award. We are honored to have you here. And
you read my resume.
I studied you, and that's my job because you're such an inspiration to the aviation industry as well. With more than 60 years in aviation experience. I just want to start off with one of your stories, and if you could just tell us what were one of the most memorable experiences in those 60 years?
Oh boy, that's hard.
That's a lot, right?
There's been so many. It really has been an incredible experience. And you mentioned the 60 years. The Wright brothers flew in 1903 as a first powered flight. And I have, in my career, flown more than 51% of that period between the beginning of flight.
That's a beautiful perspective to look at.
Yes, it is. And, but I've had so many great experiences. And if you like, I could start out about how I got started.
Yes, please.
Okay.
And how did you fall in love with aviation as well?
Well, I kind of grew up with it. I grew up in Danville, Illinois, and we had a truck farm out in the country, and we were across the street in a field from the local airport. And I had two older brothers, one 9 and the other 10 years older than myself. And we spent a lot of time going to the airport. And through that corn patch to get to the airport, we had such a deep trail that even when they cultivated, you could still see where our path was. And so spent a lot of time doing that. So I was introduced early, and both my brothers soloed before they had their driver's license.
Oh, wow.
And my older brother, Ron, was my protector, my mentor. He always took good care of me, and I won't say what the other brother was like, but Ron was my protector, and he had his airframe technician certificate before he graduated from high school.
Oh, wow.
And but unfortunately, he was killed in a tragic crash. And so my parents made the airport off limits to me. You know, I wasn't to have anything to do with that crowd over there at the airport. So then later on, after high school, I was told by everybody that I would be going to college. So I went to the University of Denver, School of Business Administration, with a specialty in business, building industry and real estate. So, but it was about the end of the second year when I was called in by the counselor, and he said, Ken, you're not doing so well. And I said, yeah, I know. And he says, well, how did you pick this school? And I said, well, we drove through Colorado one time, and I thought that Colorado was nice, and I have a friend that got a track scholarship here, and he said it's good schools. Okay. He says, how did you pick this major? And I said, well, it sounded better than liberal arts. And he said, okay. And he says, well, do you have family in the business? I said, no. Do you have a job lined up for when you graduate? I said, no. He said, oh. He says, tell me, is there anything you've ever really wanted to do? I thought about it, and I said, well, yeah, the only thing I've ever really wanted to do was fly. And he says, well, why don't you? And I said, well, my folks don't want me to. He says, is that a good enough excuse? And I thought, lightning is going to strike this guy, you know.
Like
And
a
I
true
thought
rebel.
about it, and wow, I can really choose, you know.
It's not
So-
just my parents.
So I dropped out of school and went to the airport and started taking lessons.
Oh,
and lived happily
wow.
ever after. You know?
Oh, wow. How many years did you have in college by then, studying business?
Not quite two. Not quite
Oh,
two.
wow.
Yeah.
Like a true rebel that came up for a huger call, right? To go
Yep.
into aviation.
That's right.
So how did you convince your parents?
I didn't.
I just did it.
I did it. Yes.
That's
And
beautiful.
my mom was sure that I wouldn't survive training, you know, and Dad said she would cry herself to sleep at night, and now I've outlived everybody else in the family. You know,
MashaAllah,
so-
tabarakallah.
so,
God bless. God bless. So when you first did that huge pivot from studying business, less than 2 years, you wanted to risk everything to just go into aviation.
That's right.
What were the top challenges and the top solutions or the drive that kept you going to reach where you are today?
Well, I knew I wanted to fly for a career. And in those days, there were a lot of pilots available for the airlines. It was, if you got hired by the airlines, you would start out as a flight engineer, and that might last 10 years. And then you would get into the co-pilot seat or the first officer seat, and that might take another 10 years. So it could be a long time for you wherever in the left seat. And I had an instructor that was particularly inspiring for me. And in Denver, there's a United Training Center where all their pilots go for training. And this instructor worked for United, but he also did some freelancing. And so I'd had a number of instructors prior to that, but I needed some specialized training for instrument flying. So when I met with him, as I was accustomed to doing, I would get the keys and I'd say, okay, let's go. And he says, wait a minute. So what's wrong? He says, we need to brief. Oh, really? You know? Oh, that's nice. You know, so we sat down and we went flying, and every time he touched the airplane, it was just music, you know. It was so smooth, and he was such a easy fellow to communicate with. So we get back, and I said, okay, when can we fly again? And he says, wait a minute. I said, what's wrong? He says, we need to debrief. I said, oh, that's nice.
It escaped
Yeah.
your mind completely?
Yeah, well, I'd never had that experience with an instructor before. You just get out and go, you know. And so then he says, now let's talk about what we're going to do next time, what I want you to brief, and so on like that. And so he became a model for me, someone that I really wanted to emulate. And one day after flying, we went to the coffee shop at the Sky Chef restaurant there at the airport. And he says, well, Kenny, he says, when you get your qualifications, are you going to apply for the airlines? And I said, no, I don't think so. I said, I've always associated myself with general aviation, and I think I'd like to become a flight instructor. And he says, oh, that's great. He says, Kenny, he says, when we take a new class at United Airlines, in just a few days, we can pick out everybody in the class that had experience as a flight instructor. They're more knowledgeable about the basics and so on. And he says, and then when we start flying with them, he says, they are much better pilots. And he says, in other words, Kenny, if you get 2,000 hours teaching pilots how to fly straight and level, you'll get so you can do it yourself. And so that was further inspiration for me to become a flight instructor. And so that's kind of how I got started.
And that was my third question. I mean, with your experience, with your knowledge, a lot of people choose the commercial journey, right? But
Yes.
you chose to teach pilots. You chose to make the future pilots as well.
That's right.
What, it shows that you're outspoken. It shows that you're an incredible speaker when you want to share a story. But I want you to share with us a story from all of the students and all of the pilots you've trained. what is the one story that sticks out?
Well, that's a good one. In pilot training, flight instructors will often become flight instructors so they can build time to meet qualifications for the airline or other types of flying. And others, like myself, sought to do it as a career. I think what stands out in my experience is the joy of teaching someone to fly, to share the skills that I had learned. And every time you teach a primary student to the point where they can fly solo and make that solo flight, you know, it really is a touching experience, and it makes you feel good. Flying is part knowledge. You need academic type knowledge, and to become a pilot, of course, you have to pass knowledge tests. In the flying part, that is truly a skill. You can read all you want to about flying, but actually learning the skills to fly takes practice, and the instructors are always challenged to direct that practice to good benefit, to always set a good example and not do things that would create false impression of what should or should not be done. And then as you advance into other training, moving all the way up to example for flying Learjets, teaching in Learjets, one of my greatest thrills is to take a pilot who for the first time is flying a jet, put him in the left seat, and watch as he applies that thrust, and it goes racing down the runway, and instead of climbing at 200, 300, 400 feet per minute, it's climbing at like 7,000 feet per minute, you know.
Oh, wow.
And to see them light up, you know, that is something I've never gotten tired of. And seeing pilots able to put their airplanes to use as a career, or just someone who's going to be flying for pleasure. One of the things that's very important in flying is that a pilot stays in the training loop. And we have a higher accident rate in private flying than we do other phases of flying. For example, corporate flying, like Prince Sultan and like Joe Clark, always involved in the training process by doing regular training, annual proficiency checks. But sometimes pilots will learn to fly, get their private certificate, and they tend to get away from the training cycle, and their skills begin to diminish. And we always encourage pilots, once they get their private pilot certificate, not only stay current, but go ahead and advance to other pilot qualifications and get an instrument rating and get a multi-engine rating. And then as you go on, it's learning about other airplanes and getting qualified in higher performance airplanes and that type of thing.
And you have 8 type ratings, right?
9.
9,
Yeah.
mashallah,
Yeah.
That's incredible. I want to ask you, because you mentioned the first solo of one of your student pilots, right?
Yes.
And I remember my first solo. I felt like I owned the world. When I landed that plane, I felt like I owned the world.
Yeah.
So I want to ask
That's
you, if you can go back to your first solo, Captain Ken. Did you know that you were going to dedicate your entire life to the world of aviation and of teaching students as well?
Well, I got a late start. You know, I didn't, I tried the college part first, you know, and before I really knew that I had to do that. And I think I felt like I was going all the way. And I wasn't sure where it would take me, but I was determined to do it. I qualified after my first solo, qualified for private and commercial and multi-engine, all within about 5 months. I'd done a lot of prep, passing tests, written tests, knowledge tests before I actually started flying.
How many hours did you used to train every day?
It did in the private, it was right around 50 hours, I guess. And at that time, the commercial was 200 hours, and then multi-engine isn't that many hours, but it is one of the really fun things that you do in the process.
It took you 5 months to get all the three. MashaAllah. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Last question prior to opening the Q&A. What's your favorite plane to fly today and why?
Well, I agree with Joe. The plane that I'm flying at the particular time is my favorite. There are very few airplanes that I've come across that I really don't like. And I like flying all kinds. I've said, like living in Colorado, I would rather get in a Piper Cub and fly up in the mountains than to fly in the Gulf Stream to Chicago, you know. And
spoken like a true aviator. Ken, I cannot get enough of asking you questions, but I feel like I'm being a bit selfish, and I want to open the room for Q&A. Anyone has any question for Captain Ken? Captain Joe? If we can hand the mic over here, please.
I could give you some of the story of my relationship with Prince Sultan.
Oh, for sure. I think Captain Joe wants to, but Prince Sultan says no, no, no. What are you hiding, Prince Sultan?
This is the reason why I came. I really wanted to tell people the truth, you know.
Captain Joe, you have a question?
What I wanted to ask you with your flying career for so many years, talk about a couple of the different emergencies you've had and how you've handled them.
Well, haven't had that many. I've only had one honest-to-goodness engine failure, and from engine malfunction, and that was when Prince Sultan and I were flying out of Mexico, Cozumel, and we were flying a Lear 35, and the early experience with that engine on the 35 had some problems, and we had one of them, and the engine failed going through about 16,000 feet.
Oh my God.
And so we shut it down, and we have the capability on the Lear 35 to jettison the tip tanks, the fuel in the tip tanks to lighten the load. And so we jettisoned the fuel and returned to land. And it was very routine thing, something that we practice all the time in training to fly on one engine. Sultan did a very good job of it. And the airport commandante came out and said, "Why did you come back?" And said, "Well, we had an engine failure." "Why didn't you call an emergency?" And I said, "Because it was no emergency, you know."
We handled it.
I didn't want fire trucks chasing us and running into us, you know, or whatever, you know. It was really quite routine.
Any other questions? Prince Sultan, if we can have the mic here, please.
Well, I wanted to say thank you very much. Ken, I think, you know, everybody in aviation, if lucky, would have a chance to fly. For me, it's a lifetime, since 1979. But to fly with a master, not just an instructor, but a very thoughtful, thorough person that will also let you do a lot of mistakes. And I did a lot of mistakes. Because you can't just come to a flight school, find a junior instructor and tells you how to turn the buttons and how to turn left and right. You have to fly and find yourself a master who will really take you to the next level. So Ken talked about an emergency. I think we had a few more. Landing an airplane without engines, both engines, a jet.
Oh, wow.
Engines out, but we'll keep that just between us.
You can't tease us like this.
On the ice. But you go through these life experiences. And so I started 76 flying, like I said yesterday, with a very good guy named Jack Metter, who's also a senior instructor. And then when I really wanted to fly faster and do more things, he transitioned me to Ken. So I could say Ken taught me how to fly better. Right, Ken?
Right.
No, you should say something different.
Not yet.
So I could say Ken taught me how to fly.
Not yet.
You're very humbling. Not yet.
Every time I introduce Ken to people,
Yeah.
he would whisper to them and say, not yet. and I believe him. It is really not yet. Every single flight, Joe and I and Ken agree that the plane, I just flew in a Cessna 182, and I absolutely loved it. I bumped it twice on the runway, but, so it's really an experience flying with somebody like Ken, because the flying we did was really complex and quality flying. We flew Learjets everywhere, Clay Lacy, the icon of aviation. Joe spoke about him yesterday. I knew Clay Lacy 30 years ago, more than that. So I'd say to Ken, let's find us a Learjet and go flying. Sometimes to Mexico, sometimes to South America, sometimes everywhere, just spare the moment, because we wanted to fly. And
Now
at
he's
those
saying
days,
all these nice things. His objective is to keep me from telling the rest of the story. See?
But, as aviators, a lot of the times when I rented the Learjet, I didn't have the money to pay for it. And so we'd call Clay Lacy, maybe Joe doesn't know that, and they would leave the keys to the Learjet on the desk, and the flight operation they had with nobody in there. So we'd come in, pick up the keys, Ken would sign something, and the bill would come in a month or 2 months later, and I'd pay them maybe another 3 months later. And we'd fly everywhere. So 3 things. I really learned how to fly the way I fly today, Gulfstreams and BBJs and stuff, and the blue Learjet you see on the tarmac, from Ken. Remember the Lear 25? I used to do car racing quite a bit. So one time we landed it, engine out by purpose, and then we had a hard landing and all that. But really, and I say to pilots, if you can fly a Learjet, like the one I have here, the manual Learjet, no electronics, nothing, you can fly a monkey with wings. So try to challenge yourself, diversify your flying, and I totally agree with Ken. Like Joe and I and other people, we work hard on training. We take it very seriously. We take our health very seriously. This is for the young pilots. And I want to now welcome a great team from Lebanon who are there. I didn't want to break up the Hangar talk, but we will come to see them. And Lebanon is a great country. Just for them to know, and I'm going to come and greet them in a minute, that the very first flight I took in my life when I was 3 years old was to Lebanon.
Oh, wow.
The first visa in my passport was to Lebanon.
All right.
And the first lady that came to help me and my brother, Fahad, my late brother, when we were small kids, was called Saad from Lebanon, from Trablus.
Yes.
And Lebanon, to me, is not just a country, it's a life experience. It's a beautiful country. And of course, the Lebanese have this very high-end taste and talent, So look at them, how they're dressed, as opposed to the rest of us. So thank you for coming. الله يحيي. والبارح عشان مطعم لبناني كيف ما جيتوا؟
Thank you again for coming.
So just to say, I could sit there and talk forever about my experience with Ken. It really has been an absolutely life joy to have this guy as a friend and as a mentor.
Thank you.
And as a rescuer. And, he's with me now. We're restoring airplanes. We won the biggest award in Oshkosh for our twin Bonanza for restoration.
Wow.
And we're doing a couple of projects today. And I told Ken, 3 things came to his life when he retired, more or less. All the things we do. He remarried his old sweetheart, a great lady whom I love very much. So she kept him on the straight and narrow. And he went back to Florida to live in Florida as opposed to living in Wisconsin or somewhere where there's ice all the time. So he went back to sailing. And I told him yesterday, I said, I keep you in flying, shuttling planes and restoration. If I stop, Ken will die the next day. So I'm just reiterating the words of Joe Grant, a great guy. He's the man who brought the DC-3 for King Abdulaziz as a present from President Roosevelt in 1945. We restored it fully, and I flew it in the 100th anniversary of Saudi Arabia.
Oh, wow.
And became friends of Joe Grant, I'm sorry. I'm also a good friend of Joe Clark here. Joe Grant and Jessica and Joe Grant and I went to Oshkosh in 2009 and celebrated Joe Grant's, he died at 102.
MashaAllah.
And I have a video which I'm going to put up on the website today. I hope Ray gets it, where he was sitting in the plane and doing a video for him talking to me and the DC-3 on all the noise, so we had to transcribe it. And his word to me were, don't let them stop flying, tell them not to let you stop flying. He said, if you stop flying, you die the next day. And he called me 2 days before he passed away, and he said, I think I'm passing this week or whatever, but he said, remember my words, don't stop flying. So
my God.
Beautiful.
you become an aviator when you just don't want to stop flying.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you for your
Thank
comment,
you.
Sultan, and thank you so much.
I did,
Captain.
to further answer Joe's question.
More dirt. Ziad, then more dirt.
Give us the details.
We can do this behind the scenes if you want.
Well,
What do you say, Captain?
reference the Greenland landing? Or is that what you're saying? Okay.
Remember, I was a junior pilot, and the three of you guys were senior pilots.
Yeah. That's one of the
I
problems.
wonder,
to
do you
begin
have a
with.
picture?
We had 4
Ray,
pilots on board.
Leo, do you have a picture of the plane on the ice?
Okay. We had a mission to fly from Colorado, Denver, Colorado, to the Paris Air Show in 1981. It was June of 1981. And we flew nonstop from Goose Bay, Labrador, into Reykjavik, and then on into to Prestwick, Scotland, and then on into to Paris for the Paris Air Show. And then we did some flying around Europe and so on, and we're on our way back. And Sultana and I flew the first leg. We stopped in Edinburgh, and we were departing out of Edinburgh, and he and I flew the first leg, and then we were rotating. We were going to, between the 4 of us, rotate legs until we got back to Denver, rather than stopping overnight. And we were on the leg from Reykjavik, Iceland, into Nassauiswak, Greenland. And on that leg, we didn't have the navigation equipment that would allow us to fly above 28,000. So we were flying at 28,000, and which burns more fuel. And we had enough fuel to go into Nassauiswak with a Sonderstrom alternate. If we could make that decision to go to alternate before we descended out of altitude. So as we got over there, I made a couple passes to the cockpit, and Gary was in the right seat. And how are we doing? We had one ADF that we were trying to pick up Simutac. And Simutac, you make the descent out over the water, and then you fly the 46 miles up the fjord to Nassauiswak. So he said, well, we got a signal kind of. We don't get any identifier. It's kind of weak. And so I checked from time to time, and finally I said, don't descend until we know where we are. Well, then the needle started to swing, and they said, okay, here we go. And so then we found out that it's a bad signal. Well, here we are. We've gone down. Getting back up to go to Sonderstrom would be a challenge. So we were committed at that time to go into Nassauiswak. And when we had enough break in the clouds, what we saw below did not calculate with what we should see with the two fjords that led up towards Nassauiswak. So we were urgently trying to fix our position and called Nassauiswak radio and asked them, told them we were visual on the west coast but unsure of our location. And I said, he says, well, what kind of assistance would you like? And I said, do you have VHF DF, which is a way that we can key the mic and they can tell where the signal's coming from. He says, do we have what? And they didn't have radar. They didn't have VHF DF, so not much of a way to help us. And so we're still trying to get oriented. And then Greenland Air called in. They were flying a Dash 8, de Havilland Dash 8 on an airline, one of the airlines there. And they said, have you tried 700 kilohertz, which is a regular commercial frequency? And I said, I'll try it. So we dialed in 700 kilohertz, and we got a very strong signal. And I said, where is that? And he says, same as Simulac. So we started tracking toward that. We're looking, and then we look up. We're going over land again, and then I could see way down to the south of us where the two fjords were. So then we could tell where Nassauiswak was, and we started going there. And Gary has got the calculator, and he says, well, it looks like we've got about 20 minutes worth of fuel left. And I said, if we've got 10 minutes, we'll be on the ground. And about that time, one of the engines flamed out. So I opened the cross flow and turned on the relight, and the engine spooled right back up. So I knew it was the fuel. We're better off on one engine in that configuration, that speed, than with two. So I shut the cross flow, let that engine quit. And I told him, I said, I think we've got the end of the fjord spotted where Nassauiswak is, and but there's a mountain with a north-south fault in it, and it looks like that should be straight out on final approach. And they said, if there's any doubt about making a runway, suggest you land on the ice cap. And I said, okay. In the meantime, Sultan had let the altitude creep up. We were up around 23,000, I believe. And then the left engine flamed out. And it is possible that we could have made the airport from that position.
Oh my God.
However, if you land short, you're in the fjord where there's chunks of ice floating in the water. And if you go long, well, then there's a big cliff at the on down from the end of the runway, or rapidly rising terrain. So I said, okay, let's put it on the ice cap. And so we, and the Greenland Air pilot said to suggest you go inland as far as possible to get the best conditions and land gear up. And of course, heard of that happening before, and successful landings up there. So by this time, well, before that, Gary had gotten out of the right seat, and I'm a right seat, Sultan's in the left. And so we started gliding, and then I could see the fall line was more at a bearing of 30 degrees, so we turned to that. And we tried flaps 1, that felt good. Flaps 2 still felt good. More flaps, not so good because too much drag. So we went to flaps 2, and we're gliding at about 170 knots. And it seemed like it was taking forever. And Sultan says, well, we know where we're going to land and how we're going to do it. Why don't I just pull the spoilers and we get her down and get it over with? And I said, no, let's not throw away any time. We may need it. And so then I said, okay, now what we need to do is keep the airspeed up, and that gives us kinetic energy. When we come down close to the snow, then to the surface. Well, then we rotate, stay just above, and let it land at minimum speed. And he says, okay. He says, do you want to land it? And I said, no, you're doing fine. You land it, and I'll follow through with you. Why don't you land it, and I'll follow through with you? So we made a very nice landing, and let's see, that picture was up there.
Can we please put the picture back up?
I thought I saw the picture up
Yeah,
there.
yeah, it was up. They'll put it back up.
Yeah, okay. So we landed. I think we probably skidded in the snow about 1,000 feet. We touched down. There's slight undulations in the snow, and touched down, and it came down, and then came to a nice stop.
Oh, wow. That's an amazing story.
We had put quite a bit of catering on board, and knowing that we were going to make an off-airport landing, Gary had put all the catering back into the potty in the back of the airplane. Well, our deceleration was rapid enough, the door came open, and the catering, which included yogurt and fish, spilled out onto the floor, and we could smell the yogurt. And Prince Sultan says, all right, who got sick? You know? So
That's an incredible story.
I told the passengers, I said, let's stay right here. We got a nice place to stay. Not worried about fire. We don't have any fuel left on board. And and we had advised Nassauwak that we were going to land on the ice cap, of course. And then we had a floatable ELT, a large emergency locator transmitter. And I told Gary to put it out on the wing. So he opened up the emergency exit over the wing and stepped out there, and he says, hey, it's nice out here. So then everybody wanted out on the wing. And about, I think it's about 40 minutes later, helicopter came in from Nassauwak. It was Greenland Air, and it's a Sikorsky S-62, a nice big twin-engine helicopter. And so we got on board that, and as we were about to lift off, the captain turned around and he said, look, and there's a U.S. Air Force C-130 making a low pass over our location. And they had responded to the call, and of course they had stuff that they could drop to us and drop paramedics and so on like that. But so then that night there was a big celebration there in the little village of Narsarsuaq, and we had the helicopter pilot and we had the Greenland Air pilot, and the six of us, we had two other passengers on board. Six of us were very happy. And as we sat there, Sultan says, what an incredible experience that was. He says, when we get back, get another Hawker and let's do this again.
That's an incredible
So
story.
that same Sikorsky, we later contracted through the insurance company to remove the wings and remove the engines. The Sikorsky flew the pieces into Narsarsuaq. They put the airplane back together, and Gary and I picked it up and brought it back to Denver.
That's an incredible story. What a beautiful story. You truly are a master, Captain Ken.
I have one other, what I call a crash. And we had a client, Jack Rickard, and he had a wife, Jill, Jack and Jill, and he had a hangar full of airplanes, and his wife was a very nervous flyer. And one time we were taking the Lear 24D that he had from Denver to Long Beach, and she showed up very, very nervous about the flight. And I had experienced her aversion to flying before, so I always tried to be calm for her and tried to say something to comfort her. And so anyway, we flew down to Long Beach, California. And when we got out, she was happy and everything, you know. And I said, Jill, I said, did you really enjoy the flight? She says, it wasn't that bad after I finished that bottle of wine. So then Jack said, well, what you need to do is to take some flying lessons to overcome this fear. And I've always taught that fear, F-E-A-R, means false evidence appearing real. And so sometimes when you learn more about something, well, then the fear begins to go away. So Jack had a Husky, which is a conventional geared airplane, the tail wheel, and it's a challenge. And I would have selected a easier airplane to fly for her, but he said, no, real pilots fly tail wheel airplanes, you know. So
Amen to that.
she was taking lessons from a friend of mine, Drew Chaitia, and was taking a lot of training, and she was really having a lot of difficulty. And one time Drew said, okay, today's the day, Centennial Airport, we're going to do this. And so he briefed her, told the tower what was going on and so on like that. So she taxied out and applied the power to take off, and the tail popped up rather quickly because he wasn't sitting back there. And it scared her, so she closed the throttle and wouldn't go up again. And so that shook her up a bit. Well, then was at a cocktail party with Jack and Jill and a bunch of other people, and she was telling about her misfortunes and not being able to get soloed. And I told her, I said, well, Jill, Drew is an excellent instructor. Happened to be a serious victim of birth defects, but crippling his hands and his feet, and had a crippled walk, but he was an excellent instructor. And I said, now Drew is an excellent instructor, but I said, if sometime you'd like for me to fly with you, I'd be happy to do that. And sometimes just a different approach or something like that makes a difference. She says, no, that's all right. A few days later, I was at the hangar. She was there, and she says, Ken, I think I would like for you to go fly with me. And I said, okay. And I thought, oh, she's been checking me out, you know. I wonder, well, this is good, you know. I'm kind of puffing up, you know. And she says, yeah, she says, I'd like to see what it's like to fly with that much weight in the back. That's the most serious crash I've ever had.
Oh my God, Ken, we could spend hours over here just hearing your amazing stories.
Big mistake to hand me a mic.
That's what Prince Sultan said yesterday as well. But you truly are a master. You truly are a legend, and we truly want to thank you again for being a part of Hangar Talk Saudi Arabia. Thank you again.